Hello, welcome to a lecture on a very interesting topic of international trade. This is Dr. Jubli Goswami from the Department of Economics, Lolit Sondrabharale College. And we are going to discuss Hecksher theory of international trade. And this discussion of Hecksher theory of international trade would be followed by a discussion of the Leontief paradox. So, the key takeaways from this lecture would be the basic terminologies of factor abundance and factor intensities. The terms factor abundance and factor intensities are very important to understand the Hecksher theory. Then it will be followed by an understanding of the Hecksher theory, followed by the discussion on the criticisms, and we will end this lecture with a reflection on the Leontief paradox. Before we start the Hecksher theory, we must first understand that this theory that was put forward by L.A. Hecksher and Bertil Ohlin follows from the Ricardian theory of comparative advantage. This Hecksher theory tries to explain the pattern of trade, and the earlier theory, that is the Ricardian theory, it gives a wonderful explanation of international trade between countries, saying that trade depends on the basis of comparative advantage. Every country, according to the Ricardian theory, produces and exports that commodity in which it has a comparative advantage. But the earlier explanation did not elaborate on why this comparative advantage actually occurs. Now, coming to the Hecksher theory, let us first have a reflection on the assumptions which play a vital role in understanding the pattern of trade as explained by Hecksher and Ohlin in their theory. So this theory, it assumes a 2x2x2 model, that is a two country, two commodity and a two factor trade model. So let us assume that we have two countries, country A or country B and country B, and country 1 and country 2. We may take countries A and B or country 1 and country 2 for our explanation. Then we will assume two commodities, commodity AB or XY, and two factors, that is labor and capital. The theory further assumes that the factors of production, that is labor and capital, are homogeneous in qualitative terms between the countries, but the relative factor endowments are disproportionate between countries. Now, absolute factor abundance is constant for both the countries, that is the factors of production, they are available in fixed quantities, but the relative factor endowments between the countries, they are not equal. The factors of production are freely mobile within a country, but they are not mobile between countries. That is, the theory assumes that there is factor immobility between countries. Further, the theory assumes that there is perfect competition in both the factor and the product market. There is full employment of factors of production as per this theory, the assumptions of this theory. Then there is constant returns to scale in production. The theory further assumes that the trade between countries is unrestricted. The theory assumes that there is no restrictions to the trade between countries in commodities. There is no transportation cost such that the product prices are related to factor cost. There is incomplete specialization in the trading countries. Then the theory further assumes that the production functions are such that one good is capital intensive and the other is labor intensive. The production function for each commodity is, however, same in both the countries. So, the theory assumes that the factor intensities are not reversible. What this implies is that the factor intensity, supposing commodity A is, if it is labor intensive in one country, it is labor intensive also in the other country. Similarly, commodity Y or commodity B, if it is capital intensive in one country, it will be capital intensive in the other country as well. That is, the factor intensities are not reversible. Then coming to the other assumption, that is, the technology remains constant. Now, let us understand the very important term on which the theory is based, that is factor endowments and factor intensities. So, the term factor endowments here, there are two different interpretations of relative factor abundance. One based on factor prices and the other based on factor proportions. The first definition, that is relating to the factor prices, it will be called the price definition, and the other definition, it will be called the physical definition of relative factor abundance. Now, factor endowments is followed by another core term, that is the factor intensities. Now, what do we mean by factor intensity is that in the production of one commodity, if we are using more of labor, then it will be called labor intensive good. That means we are using more of labor in the production of some good, say A, that may be machines. If we are using more of capital in the production of machines, then we will call machine as capital intensive good because we are using more of capital relative to labor in the production of machines. Similarly, for another good, say cloth, if we are using more of labor compared to capital in the production of cloth, then we will call cloth as the labor intensive good because we are using more of labor in proportion to the capital in producing cloth. Now, this factor intensity, as per our assumption, if we recall what we have discussed so far, that the factor intensities are not reversible as per the assumptions. So, if machines are capital intensive in one country, they will be capital intensive in the other country as well. And if cloth is labor intensive in one country, it will be labor intensive in the other country as well. Now, after a discussion on these two terms, factor endowments and factor intensity, and after having gone through the assumptions on which the Hecksher-Ohlin theory is based, now let us go through the explanation of this theory. It must be noted here that Hecksher-Ohlin theory may be explained by defining factor endowments both in physical terms as well as in terms of factor prices. That means following the price definition of factor endowments as well as the physical definition of relative factor abundance. So, continuing the discussion further, let us understand the Hecksher-Ohlin theory, first taking up the physical definition. So, here we are discussing the Hecksher-Ohlin theorem in terms of physical definition of factor endowments. Before elaborating on the physical definition and the explanation of Hecksher-Ohlin theory, we have to understand what the Hecksher-Ohlin theorem states. The Hecksher-Ohlin theorem states that if we have two countries trading with each other, then the country which is capital abundant will produce and export the capital intensive good and a country which is labor abundant will produce and export the labor intensive good. This is basically what the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem states. Let us further repeat what the statement is of the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. The Heckscher-Ohlin theorem states that a country which is abundant in one particular factor, it will produce and export that commodity which uses its abundant factor more intensively. Let me again repeat the statement. That is, the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem states that if we have two countries trading with each other, then a country will produce and export to the other country that commodity which uses its abundant factor more intensively. And in import, it will import that commodity from the other country which uses its scarce factor more intensively. Now, coming to the factor endowments defined in physical terms. Now, we will discuss what happens to the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, what happens to two countries which have relatively different factor endowments, and we will also explain that the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem may not hold in physical definition. That means if we define factor endowments in physical terms, then we will find that the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem may not hold in this context. So let us elaborate further, that is factor endowments in physical definition. So as per this definition, a country will be considered as relatively labor abundant if its capital to labor ratio is less than the other country. Let us further understand what this says, that according to the physical definition, a country will be considered as relatively labor abundant if its capital to labor ratio is less than the other country. So the other country, by assumption, is a capital abundant country. And in comparison to the other country, this country, which is labor abundant, it has a low capital to labor ratio. So country B will be relatively labor abundant than A if and only if it holds a lower capital to labor ratio than country A. That is, if we use K as a symbol of capital and L as a symbol of labor, then K by L ratio of A is used as a suffix here, and A represents the country to which this ratio belongs. That is, the K by L ratio of country A is greater than the K by L ratio of country B, meaning that B will be labor abundant and vice versa. So, proceeding further, the country B will be relatively labor abundant in price definition if its wage to rent ratio, if its wage to rental ratio is less than that in country A. This is the price definition of factor endowments. So what it says, that we are now comparing the factor prices, and in comparing the factor prices of labor and capital in the two countries, if we find that the wage to rental ratio is less, then the country B will be relatively labor abundant compared to country A. So if W is used for wage and R for the rate of interest, then wage to rental ratio W by R for country A will be more than the W by R ratio for country B. Proceeding further, if we use another symbol to the W by R ratio, that is Q, say Q means W by R, then the QA, that is the W by R ratio, wage to rental ratio of country A, is not equal to that of country B, because they are different in terms of factor endowments defined in price definition. So if we are comparing the wage to rental ratio of country B, which is per our assumption labor abundant, then the W by R ratio of country B, that is QB, will be greater than QA, or QA will be less than QB. Now, thus country A is said to be relatively capital abundant, for capital is relatively cheaper. And country B will be relatively labor abundant country for if labor is relatively cheaper. That means by our assumption, before we proceed further, we are taking this assumption that country A is capital abundant because capital is cheap in country A as compared to country B, and country B is relatively labor abundant because labor is relatively cheap here. Now this is following the price definition. Now let us relate to figure 1. What this figure 1 shows, it explains Hecksher-Ohlin theorem in terms of the physical definition. Here we are taking on the x-axis good B and on the y-axis good A. And by assumption, good A is, say, capital intensive and good B is labor intensive. Now looking at the diagram, what we are seeing are two production possibility curves, one of country 1 or A and the other of country 2 or B. Now looking at this diagram, it is evident that country A is capital abundant and country B is labor abundant. This is following our definition. Now we are assuming that we do not know where the production equilibrium will lie for the two countries. Now we are just assuming that let the two countries, they produce in the same proportion. And for this, we are constructing a ray OR. And we are assuming that the two countries, they produce on this ray OR, and therefore we find that the two countries, they are producing at two different points on their production possibility curves, and that is point S and point S dash. Now, if we look at the figure intently, we'll find, as per the physical definition, the capital abundant country has a bias in favor of producing the capital intensive good. Now, why is it so? Let us elaborate. Producing along the ray OR in equal proportions implies that country A or country 1 would be producing at point S dash and B would be producing at point S on their production possibility curves. So the slope of A's production possibility curve at S dash is steeper. If we look at the diagram, we'll find that the slope of A's production possibility curve at S dash is steeper than the slope of B's curve at S. Let me repeat, the slope of A's production possibility curve at S dash, that is the producer's equilibrium of country A. It is the steeper and then the slope of B's curve at S, implying that good A is cheaper in A and good B is cheap in B. So there will be a tendency for the two countries to specialize in these lines of production. That is, country A will be producing more of the capital intensive good A, and country B, the labor abundant country, as per our assumption, will be producing more of the labor intensive good B. Thus, the capital abundant country will have a bias for producing the capital intensive good, and the labor abundant country will have a bias for producing the labor intensive good. That means, going back to the Hecksher-Ohlin theorem, that is, a country will produce and export that commodity which it can produce using more of its abundant factor more intensively. Now, our assumption is that country A is a capital abundant country and country B is a labor abundant country. So country A, we have just now proved that it will have a bias for producing more of the capital intensive good, and country B, the labor abundant country, will have a bias for producing the labor intensive good. So following the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, if they are producing in these lines that country A is producing more of the capital intensive good A and country B is producing more of the labor intensive good B, then it should happen that they are producing as well as exporting these commodities. So that means country A should be producing and exporting the capital intensive good, and country B should be producing and exporting the labor intensive good. Now, what happens is that this Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, however, may not hold if we define factor endowments in physical definition. A case for that is shown in figure 2. So what we see in figure 2 is we are showing a set of indifference curves of the two countries. That is represented by I0, I1 and I0 dash, I1 dash. These are the indifference curves of the two countries A and B. I0 represents the indifference curves of A and I0 dash represents the indifference curves of country B. Now, if we look intently in this diagram, what we will find that the consumption pattern, which is represented by the indifference curves, the consumption patterns in the two countries are different. And in country A, the demand pattern, the consumption pattern is more biased towards the capital intensive good. And in country B, which was our labor abundant country, the consumption pattern is biased towards the labor intensive good. Let me again repeat. If we look at figure 2, we'll find that if I0, I1 represents the indifference curves of country A, then it shows that the demand pattern, the consumption pattern in country A is more biased towards the capital intensive good A, and the consumption pattern of country B or country 2 is more biased towards the labor intensive good B. Now, because of this demand pattern, what may happen is that country A, which was producing and specializing commodity A, which was the capital intensive good, because it is a capital abundant country, it may not export commodity A. In fact, it may export the other commodity. This holds because of the demand pattern. Because in country A, the demand pattern is more biased towards commodity A. So it may decide not to export A. Similarly, country B may not produce and export the labor intensive commodity, though it is a labor abundant country. This means that the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem will not hold in this case. Now, this was an elaboration of the fact that the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem may not hold in the physical definition. Now, let us move towards the price definition. The price definition, it explains the factor endowments in terms of factor prices. So, a country will be called capital abundant if capital is relatively cheaper. And a country will be called labor abundant if labor is relatively cheaper compared to the other country. So, what happens to the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem is elaborated in figure 3. In figure 3, what we have is that in the x-axis, we are taking labor. We are showing the quantities of labor in x-axis, and in the y-axis, we are showing the quantities of capital. And here we have the isoquants A and B, which shows A units of commodity A and B units of commodity B. Now, if we look intently at figure 3, we'll find that as per this definition, the capital abundant country A will produce and export the capital intensive good and vice versa. So let us consider the isoquants AA and BB. AA and BB are isoquants that represents the goods A and B. Thus, B is labor intensive and A is capital intensive good. Now, A units of good A, if we look at the figure 3, we'll find that A units of good A will be produced with OA1 of capital and OA1 dash of labor in country 1. OA1 dash of labor is, however, worth A1G of capital. If we look at the figure, we'll find that OA1 dash of labor is worth A1G of capital and OA1 of capital is worth A1H of labor. So the cost of producing a unit of A is OG in capital or OH in labor in country 1. Similarly, if we look at the figure again, we'll find that the cost of B unit of good B in country 1 is also OG in capital and OH in labor. A look at the diagram 3, the figure 3 will reflect that the slope of the factor price line in country 2 is less steep than the P0 P0, the factor price line in country 1. A possible factor price line in country 2 is P1 P1. If we look at the figure 3, we'll find that a possible factor price line in country 2 is P1 P1 as labor is more cheap here. So P1 P1 is tangent to the isoquant AA at E. Let me repeat that P1 P1 is tangent to the AA isoquant at E. Similarly, P2 P2 parallel to P1 P1 is tangent to the isoquant BB at F. The cost of producing a unit of good A in country 2 is OC in capital, whereas it is OD in capital for 1 unit of B. Let me repeat. The cost of producing a unit of good A in country 2 is OC in capital, whereas it is OD in capital for 1 unit of B. Now, thus in country 2, it is more expensive to produce a given amount of good A, and in country 1, it is more expensive to produce good B. That is, we find that in country 2, which is labor abundant, it is more expensive to produce a given amount of good A, which is capital intensive, and in country 1, which is by our assumption a capital abundant country, it is more expensive to produce the good B, which is labor intensive. So we may conclude that Hecksher-Ohlin theorem holds as per the price definition, that is, a country which is capital abundant will produce and export the capital intensive good, and a country which is labor abundant will produce and export the labor intensive good. So we have elaborated on the Hecksher-Ohlin theorem, which tries to explain the pattern of trade between two countries. Now, the Hecksher-Ohlin theorem is criticized on the basis of its assumptions, that the assumptions of a perfect competition holding in the product and factor market is a myth, then the assumptions of constant returns to scale, then the assumptions of having no transportation cost, or the assumption of no restrictions to trade. These are far from reality. Now, besides these criticisms, a theory, when it is put forward, is put to various empirical tests. And one such context of the Hecksher-Ohlin theorem is the Leontief paradox, which was put forward by W. Leontief. Now, an understanding of the Leontief paradox must consist of what the paradox is about, and followed by a discussion on the reconciliation between the Leontief paradox and the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem and the criticisms. So, the Leontief paradox, it was put forward by W. Leontief, and W. Leontief put the generalization of Heckscher-Ohlin theorem to test, and he used the input-output table of the US economy for the year 1947. He tested the factors used in the export and import substitution industries. Now, what he did, he considered the 1947 input-output table of USA, and he considered the export and import substitution industries. Why he considered the import substitution industries? Because the data of factor inputs in the import was relatively hard to find. The foreign data was not available. So he considered the export and import substitution industries, and he assumed that the production in both these industries are decreased by the same amount, say $1 million. Then what will be the effect on the factors of production that are released? It should follow the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. That means a country like USA, which is supposedly a capital abundant country, should use more of capital in its export sector. And in the import substitution industries, it should have been that more of labor is released. But the result that Leontief obtained in his test was shocking, because the Leontief test, it found that the capital abundant country USA, it exports labor intensive commodities. So Leontief paradox finds that trade pattern is not consistent with the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. This is Leontief paradox. That is, Leontief found in his test that the country USA, which is supposedly a capital abundant country, does not produce and export capital intensive commodities. Rather, it was the other way around, according to his findings. So it was important to explain why Leontief obtained such a result. One argument in the discussion of the reconciliation between the paradox and the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem is about the labor productivity. Here, Leontief argues that the productivity of American labor was higher than that in the foreign countries, which makes it a labor abundant country instead. Then another argument says that human capital, it is argued that Leontief did not consider the investments in human capital like skill creation, education, and health. If the human capital concept is added, then exports will become more capital intensive for USA. And Leontief did not consider these. And then another argument states that the factor intensity reversal is assumed not to exist. So Heckscher-Ohlin theorem does not recognize the reversal of factor intensities. And further going forward, another argument is given that the consumption pattern in America may be biased in favor of capital intensive goods, and the opposite may be in the trading countries. Another argument is that the tariff structure in America may lead to labor intensity of import substitution goods. It is argued that America, it subsidizes more of these labor intensive lines of production. And so the tariff structure in America may is argued to, may lead to labor intensity of the import substitution goods. Moreover, the less developed countries, they may permit duty-free import of such goods from America. Now, this Leontief paradox was criticized both in arguments and empirically. It is suggested that Leontief had wrongly chosen the year 1947 as the basis for his test. It was argued that it was a year following the Second World War, so it was not correct to choose the input-output table of 1947. It is also argued that Leontief ignores the concept of human capital. If he had uh, he had undertaken this concept of human capital, then maybe his findings would have been different. Similarly, the assumption regarding factor intensity reversal may also lead to the validation of the Leontief paradox. And similarly, tariff structures may also explain why Leontief had got such a result. Now, it is also argued that the group of 200 industries that Leontief had chosen, that was also wrong or faulty. Now, we cannot agree, therefore, following these criticisms and the arguments and the empirical findings that many writers have put forward after Leontief paradox, it suggests that we cannot agree to Leontief paradox or the Hecksher-Ohlin theorem on the basis of the Leontief paradox alone. So we have today elaborated on the Hecksher-Ohlin theorem. That is an important theorem that explains the pattern of trade between countries. We have found that the Hecksher-Ohlin theorem, it states that a country will trade with another country, and in the international trade, a country will produce and export that commodity which uses its abundant factor more intensively. Alternately, a country which is producing and exporting a capital intensive good, that is a country which is capital abundant, will produce and export the capital intensive good, and a country which is labor abundant will produce and export the labor intensive good. So this is the Hecksher-Ohlin theorem, and we have elaborated the Hecksher-Ohlin theorem in two ways, that is defining the factor endowments in physical terms and in price terms. And we have discussed that Hecksher-Ohlin theorem may not hold if we define factor endowments in the physical terms. We have finally concluded with an understanding of the Leontief paradox. So thank you so much.